So now I think that we should work on a pen and ink with watercolor. This is a very classic style. It's often used for children's books. So for example, here's an image that I drew. I was done with pen and ink and then watercolor to add in the colors for it. People also sketch this way a lot. If they go out to a scene like in Boston, they would sketch something with ink to give the general gist of the buildings that they were looking at. And then they would add in some watercolor to give a sense of the colors. And people do that as a way to do studies that they, for a scene, they then intend to paint in a longer manner, you know, with oil paints or whatever. Or sometimes they just do it because they enjoy sketching and give a quick sense of a scene. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to do a pen and ink with watercolor drawing. And again, we'll use the painted turtle as our example. Alright, so we'll start with a piece of watercolor paper. I'm using Bristol paper because it's inexpensive and it works fine with watercolor. If you're doing watercolors, it's good to have some sort of paper which is intended for watercolors, because when you put water on this paper, it will not wriggle and buckle as much as regular printer paper would. If you try to watercolor on regular printer paper, the paper tends to be very thin, and when you put water on it, it would buckle and crinkle and all sorts of things, and it would be hard to control the shapes that you wanted. You can get watercolor paper at Walmart or Job Lot or Michael's or all sorts of different places. And if you want to practice, you can cut it into smaller pieces and practice on the smaller pieces so that you use as much as possible. Alright, first step in a pen and ink drawing is often to do a rough sketch with pencil. If you want, you could just do the sketch with the pen itself. But a lot of people start with the pencil phase, because when you're doing the pencil phase, then if you make mistakes and want to go back and correct them and do something differently, then you have the ability to erase it. So get a pencil with a reasonably good point. So use a pencil sharpener to sharpen it up. And don't use the back end of the pencil eraser because these are generally awful for some reason. Erasers are cheap, so get yourself an actual eraser, and that will save you a lot of grief when you have to redraw things. Alright, so we're doing our painted turtle. Start by drawing an oval. I'm trying to draw this at an angle so that you guys can watch, and that means I can't see where I'm drawing. So I'm going to have to take a couple of stabs at this oval shape before it gets to be a way that I am happy with. It's a little too eggplanty. It's too thick in the end. This is the challenge of drawing when you can't see what you're doing, but that is all right. Well, on one hand that's good, and on the other hand now we're getting a little too small, which will cause a problem for trying to watercolor in the pieces. That shape a little bigger. A little bigger. That. That's getting closer. Still a little rough down here. Alright. We'll call that good enough for our purposes. Got a little neck collar. head. Okay. Just so challenging to do from this angle. Well, that's alright. It's good to have challenges in life because it helps us learn and grow. Alright, he's got his little painted turtle limbs, which are fairly short but compared with sea turtle limbs. Because these guys have to use them to climb up onto rocks and logs, which is just so cute. If you have never gone kayaking or rowboating or something nice and slow and quiet in a pond, canoeing I suppose, I highly recommend it. I love my kayaks. And that is just the perfect way to spend an afternoon. Drifting along a pond, looking at the little turtles, breathing in the quiet serenity of the world. Alright, I think this leg needs to be a little longer to be in proportion with the other leg. There we go. Alright, and now the shell pattern. Try and make them a little wider than last time. Alright, so we're just drawing in the pattern on the shell for our painted turtle. We're celebrating the animals at Southwick Zoo in Mendon. Painted turtles are found in the zoo, but they are also found all around us here in Massachusetts. They are a beloved part of our natural wildlife. And they are very cute and shy. If you get too close to them, they will scurry off. Alright, we got the ridge of designs on there. Now we'll get the back shapes. Fix that. Alright. This is where drawing in this direction is hard because I can't really tell where things are going. So I sort of want it to end up down at the tail. Alright, that'll do. And then we have the side pieces that come out. Alright, base shape of the turtle is done. So do pencil first so that when we are sitting there adjusting the image and making changes to it, we can easily do that with pencil and eraser. And then once we have the general design down that we want to work with, now it's time to go to the ink. And again, if you want to just do ink from the start, that's fine, it is up to you. A lot of people like to do pencil first, so that way as they adjust the design and so on, they can make that easily, because once you start working with ink, it's very hard to erase ink. So when you work on the ink step, you want to have an ink that is waterproof. The pen that I tend to use is Sakura Jelly Roll 08. It sells on Amazon and all sorts of other places. It doesn't matter that it's this particular brand, it just matters that it's waterproof, because we're going to be drawing on this with ink, and then we're going to be watercoloring over it. And if the ink is not waterproof, then when we go watering all over it, it could run and just turn everything black. So find some sort of a waterproof ink to do the ink part in, so that it does not run all over the place once we start adding water to it. The reason I use the Jelly Roll is that back for the past couple of years we've done a yearly project in Uxbridge where we all went around and sketched Uxbridge locations, and we had a urban sketcher come out from Boston and do a session with us and teach us all how to sketch. And this is the pen that she recommended. So we've got a bunch of them and they work really nicely. But whatever you want to use is fine, as long as it makes ink and it does not run when you add water to it. So now I'm going to trace over my pencil lines with the ink. I find this sort of activity to be very relaxing and meditative, especially given everything that's going on right now in our world. It's good to have something that helps you relax and stay calm. Stress is not just an emotional challenge for you, but it causes physical reactions in your body by releasing all the stress hormones and so on. So it's good to find ways to release and handle stress, because then that sends healing hormones through your body and helps your body do so much better in all sorts of ways. Helps release back pain and neck pain and all those sorts of things. So it's good to find some stress lowering activities and add them into your daily schedule, because it makes your health overall better, helps your mental focus be better, which means every other task you work on gets done more quickly and more easily, which then generally means you have less stress in your life, and it all sort of builds on each other. So hopefully when you get drawn into making little turtle shells, how the scales are working, you are focused on that and you're not thinking about all the other stuff going on in our world right now. And that helps with everything. Alright, so you don't have to follow your pencil guidelines exactly. The pencil is just in there to give you a rough idea of where you're going with all of this. So for example, when I drew my outer ring of shells, we started with an oval, as you might remember. So the oval didn't have the scallop, but now that I'm actually working on the individual little scales here, I'm adding a bit of a scallop, or this outbend, on the edges of the scales. They're not actual scales like a fish would have scales, but they are sort of shaped like scales. The shell bits. I'm sure there's a technical turtle name for those things. The fringe of the shell. So anyways, use your pencil drawing as a guideline, but it does not have to be an exact match. And it's fine if people see the pencil underneath after they're done. I drew the pencil a little dark here so that you could see it in the camera. You could draw it lighter if you want in your pictures, so that's less visible. But if you look at famous artists' watercolors, you will often see the pencil lines that they use as a guideline, and that's okay. That's part of the beauty of a watercolor. My kitten is all curled up asleep now in the tower in the window, so that is good. Kitten had their fun exploring the watercolors, and they got bored with it before we got to the paint stage, so they don't get paint all over their little feet. Alright. Put in the center line. So I'll see, now this is a time I wanted to try to adjust the line of these center things. I could, but I don't want to play with it too much. Play with it a little bit. Alright. And since pencil erases, you could now erase out the pencil in the places where you didn't exactly follow it. I would just wait a few minutes and let this ink dry. You tend to think of ink as drying instantly, but it does take a short while to dry. So it's good not to smear it while it is in the drying stage of its life. Alright, so we have drawn an initial pencil version of our turtle, so that we had a chance to erase and redraw while we were working on it. And now we have added the ink version, and we generally followed the pencil guidelines, but in some places we adjusted a little. And now I'm going to use eraser, now that I've given the ink a chance to dry, and erase out the places where I went off script and did something a little different, so that we don't have double lines. And again, you don't have to if you don't want to. It is wholly up to you. You leave the pencil lines visible. Just going to clean it up a little. Normally I would wait another minute or two to make sure that the ink is really dry, but it's not smudging, so I think it is pretty dry. Is now fully dry. That is good. Alright, so now we started with a pencil drawing, traced over it with ink. Now we have an ink drawing. In essence, we're making our own coloring book. So we have an ink shape that we could, I suppose we could crayon it in, but in this particular case, we are going to watercolor it in. Alright, so I have my watercolor, and we're going to do a different style here. In our previous version, we did wet on wet, which is where we made everything wet to start with, and then we filled it in and dropped in the color and the color spread and blossomed. But so that we can show how different things work, excuse me, we're going to do wet on dry this time so that you can see the difference. So with wet on dry, the paper will start completely dry. It is dry, there is no water on here at all. We're going to make the brush wet and get some paint on it, and then we're going to put the paint exactly where we want it to go on the dry paper. And that paint will not spread and do wild things like it did in the version where we were putting paint onto wet paper. It will just stay exactly where we put it on the dry paper. So it's a different way of doing watercolors, and it gives you more control about where you want things. So let me think for a minute about colors. I realize that painted turtles are traditionally brown. They are brown with red. But, you know, we're adding some fun here. We're celebrating the animals of Mendon, celebrating Southwick Zoo. I'm just looking through some pictures of painted turtles to see if I'm inspired. And some of them do look sort of ruby red or crimson red, depending on how the light hits them, and you know, all the varieties of genetics. So why don't we do a red turtle? Alright, so we're going to do a red turtle this time. Maybe red and orange. It'll be a counterpoint to our blue and green turtle. And if you don't have as many colors as I have, that's okay. I'll talk for a minute about the colors. This is just an inexpensive tin that I bought. I think you can get it on Amazon or Michael's or all those other kinds of places. It came empty. And then I bought a bunch of inexpensive watercolor tube kits. So then the colors come, hold on, let me put my crayons somewhere. Then the watercolors come in these tubes, and you buy a batch of them, and they can come really inexpensively if you get them at Walmart or Job Lot or somewhere like that. So you buy a batch of different colors, and you look through them and see which ones you think you're going to want to use. And you squish those colors in there. Why this is cost effective is that you buy a whole tube or a set of tubes, and you get them for very little money. You stick them into their little color bins, and then if there's a color you use a lot, like you can see this blue is nearly gone because I use that a lot, then you just squish some more of that color into that tube, into that spot there, and you use more. And if a color doesn't get used a lot, like say I never use that yellow so it just stays like that, then I don't have to buy a whole nother tin to keep things level. So let's say if I bought a regular tin where they come pre-set in their little squares. I had one around here somewhere. But anyway, you've seen them, the ones that have like 8 colors and each of them comes in a little circle. If you get a tin and you use up all your red, well now you're stuck. You have to buy a whole nother tin to be able to get your red color again. With this system, if you run out of red, then you just squeeze some more red from the tube. And if you run out of the whole red tube, then you just get another red tube. You don't have to buy all the colors again. And you can fill this with the colors you use. So if I use lots of reds, I can put lots of reds in there. If you like to use lots of blues, you can put lots of blues in there. So you can make this exactly the way that you like for the kinds of colors you use. So anyway, something to think about. It may seem complicated to have your own tin, but it actually makes life much, much easier than using a preset pan where you're at the whim and mercy of whoever made that pan. And if you run out of a color on that pan, you just have to go and buy a whole nother pan to get that one color. Alright, so that's how watercolor tins and pans work. And let us now do a red and orange turtle. So we're going to do this wet on dry. We're going to leave the paper dry. We're going to get our watercolor wet. Let's see, which of these reds do we want to use? Let's see how this one looks. We'll use this one. So I actually have a cheat sheet. That's what I should show you. If I can figure out where I put it. Nope, alright, I've lost my cheat sheet. I have a piece of watercolor paper. I have a piece of watercolor paper somewhere, which I can't spot. Ah, here it is. I knew it was around here somewhere. So what I did is I took a big piece of watercolor paper and I painted each color on here so that I can easily look at it when I can find it and see what each color looks like when it's dry, because it's sometimes hard to tell when you look at these little cubes what the color is going to look like. And I also made it darker on one side and then lighter on the other so I could see the different range of colors I can make from one of these little tins. So these are from different vendors. So the MA is for Marie's, the ALs are Artist Loft, which is the Michaels generic brand, and so on. So I could see, like, these two colors are both called green light, but you can see that there's a fair difference between the Marie's green light and the Phoenix green light. So this is just a way for me to keep track of which ones I am using and what they look like. So like that's Marie's violet and that's the Phoenix violet, and you can see that they've got some different shades in there. So anyway, it's good to do this when you are making watercolor kits, even if you buy a pan, because that way you can glance at it and see what the different colors are going to look like when they dry, which can be fairly different from when they are wet. So we are working with this one here, which is 5 up from the edge, which is the Phoenix Crimson. Alright, got the key down, got the Phoenix Crimson. Alright, so again, you think about where the light's coming from. If the light's coming from this end and it's heading down this direction, then stuff on this side should be a little lighter, stuff on that side should be a little darker, and then along the spine it should be light because the turtle's shell is curved and the light will glance off of the top edge, center line, whatever you want to call that, of the curve. So I will start, we're doing red and orange. Now when we were doing a crayon resist, these lines would naturally stay whiter along the edge because of the crayon we put in there, but pen does not resist. Pen will stay looking dark, but it will, you can paint over pen. So you want to be a little more attentive to where you're putting it. So see, this gives a different kind of effect because the paint is staying put where we put it. It's not running and spreading and doing all those other kinds of stuff. So I really enjoy the flowy nature of that. But it's good to show you different techniques so that you can see how different techniques work. And this will show you some of the layering techniques that happen in watercolor. Something that many people do quite regularly in watercolor is they put on multiple layers of the watercolor. They put on one layer and they let it dry. And then paint another layer over it, which adds, it can make it darker if you're just painting the same color over, and more saturated. If you paint multiple colors over each other, then you can create layered effects. Yes?
CNN just announced they're calling Pennsylvania for Biden.
Oh, wow. All right. Thank you. All right. So when you're doing the loose flowy method, that can be faster because you just sort of touch the paint in and it goes and fills in the whole space all by itself. With this technique, you're actually putting color in everywhere that you want it, so it can take a little longer, but you also have more control over what's happening, which makes many painters happy. Depends what your effect is. And it's good to try doing a scene in multiple ways and get a sense for which way that you like better. There's no right or wrong way here. It's all what you prefer. You are the person who controls what is happening. And again, these turtles that I'm painting aren't clearly not realistic turtles. They are whimsical and fantastical with their colors and so on. So you don't have to worry about having it be exactly the way it is in nature. If you wanted that version, then you would get a photo. Or you would paint it in a different style. You know, people certainly paint things in a realistic fashion. But at least for the style I am demonstrating here, it's more of a gentle, loose style that hopefully any level of painter, even a brand new beginning painter, can give a try and see how it works. Right, so part of the aim is to give a sense of shadow and dimension. So I'm trying to put darker things over on the left side and lighter things on the right side, with the thought that the sun's coming from this side, and that means that things over here are going to fall into the shadow more. So then as I get towards the right hand side of the painting over here, things are a little lighter. But also remember that watercolors dry lighter than when you paint them on. So the way that you see things when you initially paint them on, they're going to lighten as they dry. And that's part of why layers help, because you put something on and then it's a little light, and then you put in another layer and it gets a little darker, and then it gets a little darker with the next layer, and so on. And hopefully the process is relaxing and meditative and enjoyable, so you enjoy yourself while you're painting it, and then you enjoy the end result that you have. Or maybe you give it as a gift to someone and they enjoy the end result that they get. Let me make a post to say, ask if you have any questions. I'm here in live to chat. Alright, which orange should I go with? How about that orange right there, which happens to be, well, actually looking at my cheat sheet, I think I like, that's where the cheat sheet comes in, because if you look at that one as a dried little cube, I'm not really keen on the color, but when I look at my cheat sheet, which I got here, I really like that color on the paper, so we'll give that a shot. So that's Marie's orange yellow, which is that thing right there. Looks sort of grayer in the cube, looks nice and orangey, that I like in that picture. So yeah, we'll do the Marie's orange yellow. Part of the benefits of having a cheat sheet. Alright. Marie's orange yellow. So now we'll add the orange in on the other side. Got a little hair in there. That is alright. What I'll do, I'll paint the orange all the way up to the edge of the crimson. Let's do this over here. We'll show you how you can combine the techniques of wet on wet and wet on dry. Alright, so I'll do the left hand side of the spine. So in these areas that I painted in orange, the orange is still wet, and I made it fairly wet. So there's a fair amount of water in there, plus of course the orange color. Right, and we'll just use up the rest of this color so I don't waste it. Alright, it's pretty much gone at this point. Right, so now if I go back and use this crimson, and if I drop it into these areas, see how it spreads? So now it's doing that wet on wet thing, just in that color area. And that creates that softer edge that I like. So this is a different way of achieving that same wet on wet technique. So it spreads out into the orange, but I didn't make the whole area wet to begin with. I put the orange where I wanted it, and then I added a little bit of red into the edge so that it spread. Adding a little more red onto this left side where I want it to be darker and more in the shadows. Alright, yellow orange. Let's put it over here. So now over here, because this red is still wet and this orange is wet, they sort of blend a little, and that's the effect I'm hoping for, to get the colors a little more merged and flowy. So if you didn't want this to happen, if you wanted the colors to stay exactly where you put them, you would make sure that one color was perfectly dry before you put the next color near it. And the dry colors would not flow into each other. Like, see how over here this red is dry and this orange that I'm putting down is wet, but it is not flowing into the red, it is just staying where I put it. So if the previous color is dry and then the new color you put down is wet, it'll just lay on top of the previous color. It won't merge into it in this flowy kind of manner. But let's see, we get this later. Put this over here. Now when I'm doing this, I'm just going straight into the color with my wet pen. But you could also, clear off a little area over here and mix together exactly the color that you're after, if you don't want it to just be the direct color that comes out of the tin. So you always have control over that stuff. But I'm happy with the tin color. As part of the benefit of having these tins is that I fill it with colors that I really like a lot. So I don't have to do too much mixing, because I generally have the colors that I like a lot right there in the little tins for me. And I suppose if there was a color that you really liked that you didn't have a tin for, or a tube for, like say there was a special kind of purple that you really liked after mixing some red and some blue, you could make your own colors and then stick them into the tins so that you always had a supply of your favorite colors on hand that you like to mix. And it's fine if they dry, just like paints in a watercolor pre-made pan come to you dry. Dry is fine, you just add a little water. So if you wanted this to be waterier, you would stick some of the color over here on the side, and then you'd get some water and you'd make it waterier. So it's fairly easy to make things lighter if you need them lighter. With watercolors, to make things lighter, you just add a little more water because the paper is shining through white. The paper provides the white for you. You don't want to mix in white in general because the white that's there is not a transparent white, so you can't see through it very easily, and that means that you lose the beauty of the glowiness of the paper behind it. So in general, what you would use that white for is as a final glint or something like that. So if you're doing a starry night sky and you painted everything dark purple and dark blue and so on, and then you wanted a couple of bright white stars on the very top, you would use that white to sprinkle on the starry white stars. But in general, if you want white in a watercolor painting, you want to not paint it. So like this outside area that I want white, I leave the paper white. I don't try to paint that white. Alright, so you can see the difference here between the areas where I added red in where it was wet, and so it merged, and these other areas where it didn't merge, where it's a little more obvious where the edges are. I happen, as you can tell, to like the flowiness of paint, so what I'm more likely to do is to paint in one color, for example this orange, paint it in fairly wet, and then add in some red so that the two colors can flow while they are both wet. So I got this orange, which is wet. Now I'm going to grab a little of the crimson while that is wet and put that in along the edges and let it flow in a little more. I like that flowy atmosphere. I like the way that it just goes where it wants to go. Use what it wants to be. One benefit of doing it this way, section by section, is when we did this one, we made the entire thing wet, and then we needed to work with the entire thing before it dried. If we make a section orange, and then make that section be something that we're working on, it's more manageable for smaller areas. And you could do that with the wet on wet technique too. These are just different ways of working with shapes. On this middle area, I want to keep it generally light because that's where the sun is glinting off the turtle's back. You want to try to keep in mind where the lights and darks are while you're working with an image. With watercolor, the more layers you put on, the darker and darker it gets, but it's harder to make things lighter unless you take paper towels and, in essence, scrape away the paint. So the more that you can keep in mind where the darks and lights are, the more that you make sure you preserve the whites that you want to work with so that you don't lose them. So it's also good when you're doing a painting, or really any sort of art, to think about a range of darks and lights. The human eye likes it when there's dark areas and light areas to look at. Human eye tends to like that kind of contrast. So think about where there might be light areas in your art, and the same true with photos and everything else, where there's light areas and dark areas. And the light areas tend to draw the eye, and the dark areas tend to provide a good contrast to that. So you generally don't want the entire screen completely dark, and you don't want it all completely light. You want some dark areas, some light areas, and so on. So we want a little bit of crimson. I'm going to grab some water and dilute that out a bit, because the crimson tends to be, as you can see, is fairly dark. And I want to add a little more over here, but I don't want it to get too dark because this is the light side of the painting. So I want there to be a little more color. I don't want it to get too dark. And that looks a little dark right now, but again, this is going to dry later, so always keep in mind that things dry later than they seem. Get a little bit of that nice soft edge that I am so fond of. And it gets darker as it gets back around on this side. Alright. So we're just adding on layers. Layers of color, layers of darkness, layers of saturation. Well, let me know if you have any questions about how all of this works. So it ends up with a different kind of result. See, I could keep poking away at this for hours because I find this very restful. So you can see that this ends up with a different kind of result than the complete wet on wet design did, because with this one we had more control, but we could also still use some of the wet on wet, as you saw that I did in here, to soften the edges because I like the soft edges effect. But some areas like in here is sharper edges because I put the red on, let it dry. Put the orange on, let it dry. Put some more red on, let it dry. In some places it did merge a little, and I would like it to merge a little more. And if that red is still wet, then I should be able to get it to merge in a little bit. Yeah, alright, so it's merging a little bit. Yeah. But if you'd rather have it to be more separate, then you would just not let the two colors touch when both of them were wet. If you put the red down and let it dry, and then put the orange down and let it dry, and then maybe put some more red down and let it dry, as long as you're patient and let things dry in between stages, then the colors will remain separate from each other in terms of this merging kind of activity. Alright, so you see how the different techniques work and get some different ideas on how to work with watercolors. And this one is a watercolor pen and ink. So we did a pencil base sketch, we did ink over it, and then we colored it in with watercolor.